Welcome everybody to our very last video. This will cover the end of our content for APUS history. We will focus today on really how far do you need to go for APUSH. We're going to pick up what I call kind of the post-Reagan info. We are going to go into the vague ending of the course. We're really going to focus today on some long-term continuation of topics and see where that really gets us and kind of what ideas we may have or what questions we may have for our course. But just like period 1, period 9 is a smaller portion of the entirety of the course. So keep that in mind as we go through this information. If you do not know or do not remember every little piece of info from period 9, do not sweat it whatsoever. You just really need to understand the general trends in period 9, and that is what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to continue and finish off the bookend of this course by looking at final kind of stretches of continuation, kind of the context in which the United States faces a lot of international issues after the 1980s, different issues about the role of the government over time. Those issues are going to persist. The impact of economic and technological change, absolutely, is something we need to mention today. It's directly mentioned in the key course curriculum. The different causes and effects of domestic and international migration over time today will be touched on. We will also look at kind of different international challenges continuing even post-Cold War, because we're dealing with a lot of these issues in contemporary times. And then also this idea of American identity. What does it mean to be an American? Who is included in that discussion? Different questions or calls to question that discussion. And so when it comes down to really what we need to know about key concept 9.1, we looked at this in our first video. It says a newly ascended conservative movement achieved several political and policy goals during the 1980s and continued to strongly influence political discourse in the following decades. So the 1980s, it's important that it impacts the 1980s under the Reagan administration and of course the Bush administration, but it also does affect the Democratic Party, especially Clinton. The economic policies, economics are going to be vastly important in the 1990s as well, even though Clinton is a Democrat. So this is a long-term trend. So regardless of the type of source, whether it's from Clinton, whether it's from either of the Bushes, whether it's from Reagan, this could be a very, very useful source to you or trend for you to see. Key concept 9.2, which is going to be the bulk of our focus today, it says moving into the 21st century, the nation experienced significant technological, economic, and demographic changes. And also a continuation from yesterday, we will finish off key concept 9.3. The end of the Cold War and new challenges to U.S. leadership forced the nation to redefine its foreign policy and role in the world. So we saw the end of the Cold War being that major focus, but the other major half of key concept 9.3 is 9/11 and its impact on the United States. So today we're going to start with our look at kind of what I call the post-Reagan years. So post-Ronald Reagan, post-George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush Sr., and into the Clinton and W. Bush, or maybe Bush Jr. years of the early 2000s, and we'll see kind of how far we get. So Clinton is going to take office after winning the election of 1992, as we saw, and we're going to see where this leads us. How much of the Reagan influence is still going to be left over during the Clinton administration? So in 1992, Democrat Bill Clinton wins the election. And so we'll see kind of how this shift back to power from the Democrats, who have not been in office since Jimmy Carter, and before that, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So it's been over a decade since the Democrats have been in control of the White House. But how much of a turn back will it be to that? Or will this be much more of a new Democratic Party? One major reason why Clinton is able to win is he's able to pull back what we refer to as those Reagan Democrats. So pulling in different key constituent groups to the Democratic voter bloc and able to win the election of 1992. Bill Clinton, along with his Vice President Al Gore, are going to win the election of 1992. And his agenda as president is going to be different than Democrats in the past. He's going to reduce the size of the government, which is very, very, very different from something we saw from like an FDR or from an LBJ. Reduction of the size of the government and this emphasis on balancing the federal budget. So even though Bill Clinton is a Democrat, it is very similar to the effects, the impacts of Ronald Reagan, which we saw in the 1980s. So maybe this is a residual effect of what we would call that Reagan revolution. We also see something slightly different than the Reagan administration, though. So although there is some similarity, there are some differences, right? In this emphasis to reform the welfare system, extend health care to all Americans, a precursor to the Affordable Health Care Act, what we call Obamacare, at some points, and really to promote economic growth. So notice that this emphasis on kind of fiscal growth and maybe fiscal management. So this is a residual effect for sure of the Reagan administration. Early on in the Clinton years, an attempt is going to be made to implement a universal health care coverage plan. It's going to fail, but it's a precursor to what we call Obamacare today from the early 2000 teens, which is actually known as the Affordable Health Care Act. And in the early 1990s, this plan is dubbed Hillary Care after Hillary Clinton, the first lady who eventually runs for office, for the presidential office in 2016. But when the bill is defeated so swiftly, the midterm elections in 1994 are going to have a huge sort of Republican swell. And Republicans are going to take back a lot of seats in 1994. One of the most vocal voices from that group would be Newt Gingrich, who is offering a plan that he calls a contract with America. It's more of a return to like the Reagan-style tax cuts of the 1980s, increased military spending, limited role of government. And Clinton is going to sort of get back at the Republicans and undermine them in the same way that he was undermined in a way by reducing the size of the government, which doesn't really allow them, one, to accomplish that goal, but also makes it very similar to some of the key tenets that they're fighting for. So it makes it very difficult to get a groundswell of support fighting against someone that is already doing what you're sort of promising. And Clinton is keeping this Reagan-style republicanism going. He even says in this quote, "The era of big government is over." So it's a continuation of the things that we saw in the 1980s, even though it's a different political party. In the same way that even though Eisenhower was Republican in the 1950s, there still was a domestic similarity in a slight way to what we saw in the FDR administration prior to him. And so in 1996, Clinton is still going to be quite popular, and he is going to win re-election. So he's going to win re-election in 1996. The second back-to-back two-term president since Eisenhower in the 1950s, so this is becoming more of a contemporary trend. Clinton, foreign policy-wise, is really going to emphasize free trade. Again, remember that emphasis on the economy, a good balanced budget, but also economic prosperity. He's going to sign what's known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. It was originally sort of initiated under Bush, but actually confirmed and finished under the Clinton administration. It kind of breaks down all sort of trade barriers between the North American countries of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, allowing free trade back and forth. There is going to be a general agreement on tariffs and trades to cut down tariffs, which will allow for goods from other countries coming into the United States not to be placed as high of a price. The World Trade Organization is going to help settle trade disputes amongst a bunch of different nations. So the idea here is, again, a continuation of this emphasis on commerce, international trade, and the economy that is a continual residual effect of the neoconservative wave we saw at the beginning of the 1980s, really kind of typified with the Reagan administration. And again, I know I've said this multiple times already, but even though Clinton is a Democrat, he's keeping some of these ideas. So if you understand that trend, you can find the answer in the multiple choice section when you get to it in the upper 40s or in the 50s of the multiple choice. And you'll be able to find that answer regardless of what that stimuli is. You're going to get some sort of question as a nod to something like this. As far as international peacekeeping, it becomes very difficult for Clinton to handle all of the issue that he's going to be faced with. There are troops that are sent to Somalia, which is in Africa on the eastern coast, to try to restore order to the civil war that's breaking out there. So it's not a military conquest, but an attempt to restore peace and some humanitarian aid or international peacekeeping organization. And then in 1999, the U.S. and the UN send troops to Bosnia, which is part of Yugoslavia, to try to stop the ethnic cleansing that's happening there. So there's a lot of events that are happening internationally, and it's not the same type of war that was feared maybe during the Reagan years and the Cold War or prior, but he's still dealing with international foreign policy in a different way. In the 1990s, Clinton does have an economic boom, but the problem is there are a lot of tensions during this time period domestically. Things are not all hunky-dory. There are still race relations. Probably the best example of this is the Rodney King trial in 1992, where a black motorist is pulled out of his car and thrown to the ground by a group of police officers and beaten nearly to the inch of death. This was actually captured on camera, which is this picture that you're seeing here, are clips from that video. It's really what sometimes people call the first contemporary police brutality case. And this video is then submitted to the court to view and is used as evidence. But the problem is all of these officers get off on charges of excessive use of force. And so riots break out in Los Angeles in 1992. Buildings are burning. There are people in the streets protesting this injustice. There's an example of racial disparity in the United States, of racial inequality, really exemplified by this case and this issue. We also see examples of terrorism in the United States in the 1990s, such as the World Trade Center being bombed, when a dump truck filled with explosives is run into the base of the tower, it explodes, but the towers do not fall. This is going to be followed up by the September 11th attacks in 2001, which will be successful in taking down those towers. There's also the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 when a federal building is bombed. Both of these events are just examples of the increasing tensions in the United States and more modern contemporary issues that the United States is dealing with in the 1990s, and then we're going to see in the 2000s, 2010s, and now we're in the 2020s. In addition to that, Clinton is dealing with scandals of his own, including the Whitewater scandal, which involves a building project that Clinton was a part of, and then he takes office. The building project is getting government subsidies. It falls under, and so they are getting some kickback there. And the questions are, did Clinton know what was going on or not? And then probably the more infamous scandal is the Monica Lewinsky scandal, where Clinton has inappropriate relations with an intern. Now, the big thing about the Monica Lewinsky scandal and what students tend to forget, and I wouldn't say just students, I was going as far as most Americans tend to forget, is although it is disgusting, cheating on your wife is not a crime. So Clinton does not get in trouble for that. It's not just a scandal. It takes a step further with the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Clinton becomes only the second president in U.S. history to be impeached. And so Clinton is impeached. Impeached, remember, means charged with a crime. He is not charged with the crime of cheating on your wife because that is not a crime. It may be disgusting, may be despicable. You may not be able to trust or look at a person the same way, but that is not a crime. He gets charged with, as it says in this Washington Post article from 1998, with perjury, lying under oath, and obstruction, obstructing an investigation. Now, Clinton will be impeached, charged with a crime, taken to trial, but he will not be convicted. He will not be removed from office. So Clinton was only the second president ever in U.S. history, and now, as of 2019 to 2020, we have our third president that has ever been impeached in Donald J. Trump. So this is a very more modern issue, right? Both of these presidents within really 20 years of each other being impeached, and the only other one was Andrew Johnson, following Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War, post-Civil War, early parts of Reconstruction. Clinton, as we said, was not removed from office, so he gets to stay in office. He's going to finish his term up until 2000, when the next election is going to roll around. And the election of 2000 is a very, very controversial one. It's a very, very interesting one. It's going to deal with the son of George H.W. Bush, that was the vice president to Ronald Reagan and served as president from 1988 to 1992. So his son, George W. Bush, is going to run for office in 2000. The election of 2000 becomes one of the most complicated and confusing elections of all time. It is the closest since Nixon-Kennedy in 1960, and it's really the only disputed election that we've seen since 1876, which is the election that leads to the Compromise of 1877, or the end of Reconstruction. And so there's a lot of confusion about who actually wins. It's this weird back and forth, and it all centers around the so-called hanging chads or dimpled chads in Florida. Now, a chad is not just a frat boy. A chad is a tab of paper hanging off of a ballot. So at this time, especially in Florida, which was a huge key battleground state, that depending on who won Florida, depended on who won the election. And so when you look at this picture over here on the right, you see certain holes punctured on this piece of paper. And this is just one example. There was a machine in which you would insert this piece of paper. You would use some sort of a pen and puncture through this piece of paper. But as you fed that piece of paper through the machine, if that hole that is created, kind of think of it like a hole puncher, sometimes it doesn't completely come off. That hanging little piece of paper is actually called a chad. And if that hanging chad was still in place and you fed it through a reading machine, it may slide back into place and it may not have been read, number one. Number two, if it's not punctured fully all the way, did that individual voter actually mean to cast that vote, or was that a mistake? Was it fully actual casted? And so we see in this Newsweek cover over on the left, the winner is nobody actually knows. And it's going to take some time before we actually get a declared winner. Over a month is going to go on, and we're not going to know who actually won the election in an era of increased technology, in an era of increased information, where now we know the night of, right, who actually won this election. It is very concerning, alarming, and confusing for the American public. To make things more complicated with this is no one actually knows who won the results of the election of 2000 in Florida at the time, and the governor of Florida calls it after the initial result that has George Bush winning the election. To make things more complicated, the governor of Florida is George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush. So now it looks like the whole Bush family is in on it. Looks like a lot of shaky, sketchy politics. And so the opposing runner from the Democratic Party, who is a man by the name of Al Gore, who was the vice president for Bill Clinton the past 2 terms, is going to call for an individual recount in Florida of all of these votes. And Florida is no small state. So it makes this issue even more grueling, even more confusing. And when you look at the actual voting precincts, we see down here in Florida, right? There's a lot of red, yes, but there is blue, and it just seems like if you count the numbers of counties of red versus blue, that it seems very clear that the Republicans win in this case, but not all counties are balanced out with the same amount of population. So remember, to win a state, right, you need the most popular votes in that individual state. And so although maybe Bush won more counties, those counties that Gore won had an extremely high population. And so as this counting goes on and on and on, no one's exactly sure who's winning. But when we're looking at the results, it seems like it's getting closer. It's within hundreds of votes of each other, and no one is actually sure who won. But when the actual results do come out, it is given to George W. Bush. Now, the results are not finalized by the state of Florida. The Supreme Court is actually going to get involved in the court case Bush v. Gore in 2000. The recount is going to be stopped by the Supreme Court, and Bush is going to be declared the winner of the election. This is super important because of this result of this election, the Republicans are now going to take back over. It's a very controversial election. It splits a lot of Americans, and as we can see here in this political cartoon up above, that it seemed as it's much more cumbersome and difficult to vote. That there are questions of the legality and the security of the voting process in Florida, which becomes a very pressing issue for future elections. Even still today, that is still a question about how to secure voting in a proper, ethical way. And so we've changed the way that we voted in order to hopefully eliminate some of these issues, but it was not without issues in 2000s. To make things even more complicated in this election, Bush won the Electoral College vote, but he lost the popular vote, similarly to how Trump won the Electoral College vote in 2016, but lost the popular vote. And so it becomes a sense of contention here, and so politics will not go over easily. Not to mention a very divisive election, one of the biggest events in all of American history is going to happen within the first year that Bush is in office. That key event that is going to happen is the attacks on September 11th of 2001 by the fundamentalist group, the terrorist group, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, remember, is the group from the 1980s that was formed in response to this anti-American sentiment swelling in the Middle East as a result of our heavy kind of police-like force. It's going to lead to the American invasion of Afghanistan and the hunt for their leader, Osama bin Laden. But its terrorist attacks on September 11th are not just a massive tragedy. They are a huge turning point in American history. Similarly, in the scope of how Pearl Harbor was a massive turning point for foreign policy, September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks on the United States can be marked as a massive turning point for foreign policy and even for domestic discussions as well. Bush declares this war on terror, this war on terrorism around the world. This declaration of these three countries, this axis of evil, the dictatorships in North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And it's going to lead to the American invasion of Iraq, the removal of Saddam Hussein, right, who was not removed by his father back in the early 1990s, so about a decade later, plus the continual hunt for Osama bin Laden. That's not actually going to happen until the Obama administration. But there are effects on the home front besides the massive loss of life, besides the massive tragedy. There are other questions that we can relate to previous topics we've seen in our course, which is really the important part of these similar threads throughout history that we've seen. A great example of this is something called the Patriot Act, which was passed after the terrorist attacks on 9/11, that gives the government surveillance power over citizens in order to find terrorists. And in this world, there is this delicate balance and this trade-off between security and safety and liberty and freedom, personal freedom. We can give the government infinite amounts of information into our personal lives to try to control things and limit things, but that would protect us from the consistent attacks of maybe terror and violence and things like that, and finding these terrorists within our country. But you would have to give up freedom in order to do that, and that's sort of this balance between individual liberties, like civil liberties, during wartime that we've seen in World War I and World War II. The government has the ability, as a result of the Patriot Act, to share private information of individual citizens with intelligence agencies. The government can wiretap any device of an individual after they've given authority to wiretap an individual, that for all forms of devices, that they don't need consistent reapproval, so they could wiretap, right, your cell phone, your home phone. There are always the questions of the federal government watching through perhaps the camera on your laptop or on your cell phone. It allows authorities to search a home or a business without immediate notification to the occupant or to the home person. There's no expiration date on this clause, which is really, really important for the Patriot Act. While these previous clauses maybe had a multiple month or maybe 1 year timestamp, and it expanded really the government's ban on giving material support, right? It's not just tangible items like guns and bullets and munitions, but even information and expertise, advice to terrorists is considered treasonous. And so this scope of effect on the American home front and the impact on civil liberties is very wide sweeping. And this is something that many Americans are still debating and dealing with today, the legality or the properness of these laws. But this is a direct effect of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 because of the fear or the impact on the American public, that in order to prevent something like happening this again, that Americans are giving up some of their civil liberties in order to allowing this law to go through, in the same way that freedom of speech or press was often censored in, for example, both world wars. Right? And I've already mentioned this, but really think of examples of times when this has happened. And I've mentioned World War I and World War II, which are in the 1900s, but there are previous times when this has happened as well. To me, the next best example outside of the 1900s, go back to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And being able to draw these comparisons are really what, for those of you that are shooting for that complexity point on the DBQ, this is a great example for ways to do that. Developing a coherent, complex analysis. A name drop is not going to do it, or as I call just word vomiting, that's not going to be enough. But these are different ways for you to be able to draw and pull that information. American foreign policy is going to be drastically shaped by 9/11, not just the home front. This is sometimes referred to as the Bush Doctrine, where America sort of declares war on terrorism, and it doesn't matter where in the world that is. And George Bush sort of draws this line in the sand, saying that you're either with us or you're against us in this fight against terrorism, and makes it a very black and white issue when it comes to, do we get involved or do we not? And it comes down to preventing future terror attacks from happening, or squashing the group that attacked us on September 11th. And so America really begins an increasing involvement in trying to prevent terrorist attacks around the world. And it's a very, very modern issue. We see some early examples in the Clinton administration, but especially since September 11th, 2001, this has been an increasingly prevalent issue around the world. America despite all of this, is an increasingly large military power. And so the United States is still beefing up its military. We see this again, a residual effect from the 1980s even into the early 2000s. We see here a continual massive increase of spending that we have on our military, larger than the next countries in line combined. But the United States is taking on this moniker of a police-like force trying to prevent terrorism around the world, and it's going to lead us into long-lasting conflicts in the Middle East and around the world, into other little corners as well. There is not full necessary support for the war. Some people question if this war was necessary whatsoever, but along with that come various scandals, and it makes it very hard to make this a war of good versus evil, as number one, the war rages on, and number two, that we have incidents like we have at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay with cases of torturing. And we see, for example, in the individual on the left, as you can see that man standing on the box, and he has wires attached to his fingers that if they go below a certain level that he's going to be shocked. And we see issues of waterboarding, other forms of torture, trying to extract information. Are there rules of how to treat prisoners in order to extract information? Are there ways that terrorists should be treated, and these incidents happening off of U.S. soil? Does that change anything for the rules about how this is done, or even just the public perception of the American people of what the U.S. government and U.S. Army and military are doing in these areas? So there becomes increasing conflict and debate over these issues as well. Bush is going to be reelected in 2004. And in 2008, there is going to be no incumbent running for the Republicans. And so a new Republican candidate and a new Democratic candidate will be put up. John McCain versus Barack Obama. And Obama is going to win by a very, very large amount. He's going to win over 2/3 of the Electoral College votes and take the White House, the first time since Bill Clinton in the 1990s. In 2012, he will win again, a slightly smaller margin, but still a very, very large margin, and will take 2 back-to-back terms. So we saw Clinton, 2 back-to-back full terms, W. Bush, 2 back-to-back full terms, Obama, 2 back-to-back full terms, flipping parties after those 8 years. And now we have a Republican who wins in 2016 in Donald Trump. And we'll see if he is able to win re-election in 2020, which hasn't happened yet when I'm making this video at this time. But the Obama administration is important for various reasons. We're looking at the Obama administration as a continuation of the events that we've seen since the 1980s in Period 9, and we're looking not so much for specific incidences, but we're looking for general trends that have consisted. Now, this is where the course gets a little difficult. The course gets difficult because the ending of the course, Period 9, says 1980 to present. And there's many different debates between different teachers about what information is necessary. And my rule usually is once we get to 9/11, the information specifics is not really needed, but you can use it to drive home the points of general trends that have increased. But there are some landmark events to take of note. For example, the Obama administration, the first African-American president. That is a huge, huge landmark event. But there are some continued things that we have dealt with since the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, Bush and Reagan, of this continued issue of involvement around the world, namely with the past decade or two since Obama, of this issue with terror. The only real change that we're going to see is this movement away from large-scale forces like army occupations we see with the Bush administration to using much more special forces and the heavy reliance on drones. And this is a huge increase in Afghanistan that we will see under the Obama administration. So it is not a full-scale de-escalation and de-armament and withdrawal of troops. And there's going to be a little conflict and muddled message back and forth from the Obama administration during his 8 years in office. So we're really looking at this through a lens of, again, a continued struggle since 9/11, and we're just looking at residual effects. So not important that you know the specifics of the Obama administration for this course, but we can look at it long-term trends to get deeper understanding. Obama is going to inherit the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and early on he's going to draw troops out. But the increase of presence in Afghanistan is going to be placed for security measures, not necessarily for occupation. And many people just look at this as going from Iraq right into Afghanistan. And so has much really changed? And that becomes a huge debate and question. There is also a heavy reliance on drone strikes later in the presidency rather than, again, like I said before, occupational forces. So this is most definitely a change of more modern technology and more modern military strategy. But there are some major successes, such as the capture and death of Osama bin Laden, what's known as Operation Geronimo. And that has finally happened in the Obama administration, which has been a continued struggle since 2001. This happens in 2012. But the United States is still involved with foreign policy in the Middle East. The Obama administration supports rebels in what is known as the Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East, and the Crimean crisis in Ukraine, supporting different rebel groups trying to overthrow regimes that we don't necessarily support. So is this just a residual of similar tactics from the Cold War or not? That can be up for you to debate. But America's presence in the Middle East is not disappearing whatsoever. Domestically, probably the biggest incident that Obama inherits is the Great Recession, sometimes referred to as 2008. The government bailout plan of the failing financial industry that happens in 2007, 2008, the housing crash. And you see this cartoon kind of pointing at the increase in drone strikes. No, sir, we can't use drone strikes to stop that. But that big kind of moment is the beginning of what Obama kind of steps into. And so he's dealt with sort of picking up those pieces and trying to restore the economy afterwards. So he's dealing with the residual effects of what takes place at the very end of the Bush administration. One other major domestic change is Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act that extends health benefits to so many different Americans that was attempted back in the 1990s under Clinton and failed, but is actually successful under the Obama administration in the early 2010s. Despite this, there are many different debates about the positives of this plan, the Affordable Health Care Plan. Some people call it socialism. Some people call this more of a question on morals and traditional Catholic values of what's being supported by the government. Some people see this as an oversight of government control. And so there's, again, more debates back and forth about similar issues that we have seen throughout the entirety of the course since the Constitution. The debate over the size, the influence, or the purpose of government has not been anything new, but the topics in which they're debating about through that lens has changed. We definitely see a controversial election in 2016, which is similar to the election of 2000, in which the winner of the Electoral College vote, in this case Donald Trump, does not win the popular vote. And so it is a quite divisive election moving forward. And when you look at it in the scope of U.S. history, is it the most divisive election? I definitely wouldn't say that, but you may say it's up in the general ballpark. There are issues on both sides. Donald Trump does not have any political experience. He labels himself as a political outsider, but he does pull or try to pull in some memories of like the Reagan administration. He uses a very similar campaign slogan in Make America Great Again as Reagan's campaign slogan in the 1980s. But there are a variety of character issues that are brought up about Donald Trump, whether xenophobia or more specifically the Access Hollywood tape, in which Donald Trump is recorded saying some very obscene things about groping women. But despite all of that, he is still elected because of the big claims against Hillary Clinton. There's two things that she really has to deal with. The first major thing deals with just getting the nomination, and it's a very divisive selection process, much longer than the Republicans, in which Bernie Sanders wins the who's going against Bernie Sanders to win the nomination. And there's still a lot of residual tension there going into the election, number one. Number two, the big claim against Hillary Clinton based on voting surveys after people went to the polls was not being able to trust Hillary Clinton, that she is seen as a corrupt inside politician from her time serving as the Secretary of State under the Obama administration, sending private government emails on non-secure servers, her lack of aid or response sent to Benghazi in Libya, where American servicemen were killed as attacks overran an embassy that they were protecting that they called for aid and were not given. And so Clinton loses this election despite winning the popular vote. So Trump wins more states, although when Clinton did win, she won some states like California by very, very, very large margins. So the election of 2016, when I say it's the most divisive election of all time, no, not absolutely not. But it is a very important event for modern politics. Now, is there anything to note about Donald Trump? We don't know exactly how far his presidency will reign. Will he get a re-election in 2020? Nobody knows. He's dealing with similar foreign developments like immigration. We hear the calls from him during the election to build a wall between the United States and Mexico to prevent increased immigration into the United States. Domestically, calls for tax cuts, but probably the biggest landmark thing is his actual impeachment. But again, he's impeached, but not removed. So he becomes the third president impeached, yet never removed. And also dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. Now, with just like the Obama administration and the Trump administration, I would say leave them off the test. It's going to usually be a stronger stretch. Maybe you could do Obama, but I would not do the current president. It becomes more current events rather than history. It's harder to make a strong, longer, continual argument or comparison in that case. So I typically would say stay away from whoever the current president is, and try to stay not long. I would say maybe the max you would go up to is about 9/11, but this is just for continuation. So as far as how present should you go, to me, once you hit in period 9, the Reagan presidency, and you hit 9/11, you've got everything you need to know if you need the bare bones. But there are other general contemporary trends to talk about during the 1980s, 1990s, and more contemporary times, early 2000s, 2000 teens, and eventually into the 2020s, that continue to this day. Probably one of the most important technological innovations in all of contemporary US history has to be the internet. The internet has completely changed all social, economic, political ways in which we interact with the rest of the world, if not just our own country. The evolution of the World Wide Web. That's what that www stands for at the beginning of the URLs that maybe you type in or you click on or are generated. But the internet, this increased access to information, creates a very unique experience where all of this information is at the tip of your fingers, and maybe your parents or your teachers tell you this all the time, but in this increasing digital world where researching is not a very difficult skill or cumbersome skill anymore. Now, maybe quality research is, but research in general is not very difficult. It can happen in an instant from your phone, from a tablet, from a computer. And this changes the way that we interact with the media and the way that the media fact checks or overlooks information that is dispelled or our access to information. It cuts down that time. It also creates, the curriculum says, new social networks and behaviors about how we can do business. Something like eBay that's created in the end of the 1990s, early 2000s is a great example of a way that business is done differently. Kind of like an Amazon, right? In the exact same way, is a huge revolution in the way that we do business. It's very similar in a way to kind of how Sears was started with the Transcontinental Railroad, using the fastest form of information and traveling. Now, it won't travel the goods any faster, but will travel the information, the orders, and the access to these goods in a much quicker, more expedient way. And this revolutionizes the world because of the cut down of distance. Now, today, we can have information that's happening halfway across the world in just a few seconds through things like Twitter or other more reliable news sources, but we can get information at a very rapid rate. We also see a continual trend of immigration, and this chart shows immigration from different regions, all the way back from the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. We're seeing heavy immigration from Europe, primarily the Irish, the German, until we get to the later part of the 1800s, where we see immigration from Southern Europe, like the Italians, Eastern Europeans coming over, Russian Jews, Chinese immigrants coming over before further restrictions. We see different forms of immigration in later periods, as we see here from different regions of the world as well. That blue, it's not just from Europe. We see increased immigration from Latin America, which we see represented in the yellow, and from different Asian countries. We think about results of different wars and conflicts, like the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, and those residual effects impacting American society, leaving a war-torn country, searching for a better life. Another major contemporary issue is definitely the environmentalist movement, things that we've seen trends continue since the publishing of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962, the EPA created under the Nixon administration, along with the celebration of Earth Day, this emphasis on caring for the environment, long-term trends of maybe the progressive movement and questioning the use and how do we access the environment, or even the preservation versus conservationist movement. We see the questioning of the use of fossil fuels like oil, natural gases, and fracking and coal, and we look for more renewable sources of energy, such as nuclear energy, solar energy, electric, or kind of hybrids, even in terms of cars or other forms of energy. And so this becomes a more contemporary issue with the increased footprint, carbon footprint that the world is leaving with our more modernized society, questioning, very similar to like in the Gilded Age, what impact are we having on our environment and what should we do to combat that? This is really typified in the modern issue. It's not necessarily just a modern issue, but something that is much more heavily debated, discussed, and realized in the 2000s, this issue of global warming and climate change, the human impact on the CO2 levels in the world, and what that's doing to our environment and the depleting ozone layer. So these are things that, again, you don't need to have specific examples from period 9, but just understand the long-term trends of technological impacts. How is that similar to other areas? Environmentalist movement, how that's continued throughout the 1900s and changed in different ways. And also immigration, how this is a continual trend and how that is affecting American culture. And so I would like to say congratulations to all of you. We did it. We completed it. You have this wonderful clip from Forrest Gump. I'm pretty tired. I think I'll go home now, right? That we're done. We overcame that mountain. We completed all of the content through period 9, right? It's been a very, very, very long journey. But now that you're done, and hopefully after you're done watching this, and if you're done with the test, that you can go rest now. You deserve it. If you have any questions, as always, you know I'm always here for you. Just drop a couple comments in the section down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Peace.